There was a time now buried beneath the dust of forgotten stone, when the Mediterranean glittered not just with sunlight, but with power. From the banks of the Nile to the highlands of Anatolia, from the fortified palaces of Mycenae to the merchant ports of Ugarit, a world pulsed with civilization. This was the late Bronze Age, an age of kings and merchants, scribes and warriors gods, carved in gold, and treaties etched in clay. It was not a world of isolated peoples, but of empires connected like a fine tapestry. Threads of trade, diplomacy, and war tied them together, and like any tapestry, when the threads began to fray, the entire picture would unravel. A web of great powers. The kingdoms of this age were not myth. They were real, documented, intricate, proud. Egypt ruled from the fertile floodplains of the Nile under the steady gaze of pharaohs who styled themselves gods. The Hittites in central Anatolia had carved an empire with sword and treaty alike, sending letters to kings with phrases like, "my brother," and demanding raids in exchange for peace, in exchange for aught. The Mycenaeans of mainland Greece, a proud warrior society, built their citadels high on hills, crowned with lions, and guarded by walls so thick they seemed eternal. Across the Aegean Minoan culture still echoed in the stones of Knossos, though its prime had passed. And there was Ugarit, shining, thriving Ugarit, a city-state on the coast of modern-day Syria. Its archives held thousands of clay tablets, receipts, myths, diplomatic letters, a civilization recorded and filed. It was here that trade between East and West thrived most. Copper from Cyprus, tin from the East, gold from Egypt, horses from the steppe. Merchants and messengers crossed borders daily. Peace through power and dependence. Though wars were waged, the world was in many ways at peace, a kind of managed competition where diplomacy played a larger role than destruction. The great powers sent gifts, arranged marriages, and signed treaties in cuneiform. But underneath this order was a deep dependence. Cities relied on food shipments from abroad. Palaces depended on bronze and alloy of copper and tin for weapons, tools, and prestige. Tin, rare and distant, was the lifeblood of armies and status alike. And so the powers danced a careful dance. Ships set sail each day, loaded with grain, incense, wine, and bronze. In return, they brought back papyrus glass beads, oxhide ingots, lapis lazuli, and messages from distant kings. The sea, not the sword, ruled this world. The glory of the scribes. This was a literate age. Scribes held the keys to the kingdom, not warriors. In palaces across the Mediterranean, trained officials recorded cargo manifests, religious hymns, agricultural quotas, and epic stories. A Hittite king might dictate a treaty to 3 different languages, Akkadian for diplomacy, Luwian for local law, and Hittite for the gods. In Egypt, hieroglyphs told stories of eternal glory. In Ugarit, the first alphabet, not syllables, but true letters, was born. Civilization had reached a height it would not see again for centuries. The calm before the tempest, but no age lasts forever. Beneath the surface of this shining world, the fault lines began to tremble. Clues scattered across clay tablets and archaeological ruins suggest rising pressures. Letters between kings became more urgent, less ceremonial. Grain shipments were delayed. Famines whispered through the hills of Canaan. Rebels rose in borderlands. Earthquakes rocked cities. Climate patterns shifted ever so slightly, and somewhere over the darkening horizon, ships began to move, ships that bore no diplomatic envoys, only warriors, foreshadowing the fall. In a letter found in Amarna, an Egyptian vassal begs for aid. The enemy is stronger than we. They have burned our cities and ravaged our fields. In Ugarit, the last king writes to a neighboring ally, "The enemy ships are approaching. They are ravaging my lands. My gods do not answer me." That letter was never sent. It was buried in ash. Somehow across the entire eastern Mediterranean, from Greece to Egypt, from Anatolia to the Levant, civilization collapsed nearly simultaneously within a span of a few decades. No single empire survived untouched. Some vanished without a trace, a shattered mirror. What we remember of this age comes not from its survivors, but from its ruins. And yet it was a time of greatness, a connected world, complex and brilliant, sophisticated and rich. Its loss was not merely the fall of cities, it was the end of memory itself. This is the story of that loss. The unraveling of the Bronze Age world, told not as a single event, but a slow apocalypse. Not with a bang, but with fire, famine, migration, and silence. In the chapters to come, you will walk among broken palaces, listen to dying kings, and sail with the strangers who brought the end. But for now, remember, before the fall, there was peace. Before the silence, there was music. Before the apocalypse, there was a world. To understand the Bronze Age collapse, one must first understand the metal that gave the era its name, bronze, and the delicate, far-reaching network that sustained it. Bronze was more than a material. It was civilization itself. From the blades of soldiers to the tools of farmers, from religious idols to ornamental jewelry, bronze touched every corner of life. But bronze required two ingredients, copper and tin. And while copper was relatively common, tin was rare, scarce, scattered, and distant. This made tin the invisible backbone of the Bronze Age, and its supply routes the fragile arteries of empire, the alchemy of empire. In the palaces of Mycenae and the halls of the Hittites, bronze was status, strength, and security. A king's wealth could be measured in oxhide ingots, great copper slabs shipped from Cyprus, shaped like animal hides for easy transport. But without tin, copper was soft, pliable, and useless for war. The Mycenaeans mined copper on their islands and imported more from Cyprus, which became known in trade texts as a lashia. Tin, on the other hand, was a mystery. No great tin mines lay within the heartlands of Egypt, Greece, or Mesopotamia. Instead, it came from shadowy sources, possibly from as far west as modern-day Britain and as far east as Central Asia. The journey was long, dangerous, and largely invisible to history. It was these trade routes, fragile and vital, that held the ancient world together, a maritime machine. The Mediterranean was not a barrier. It was a highway. Merchant ships plied its waters like bees in a hive, connecting distant lands in a web of exchange. Egyptian papyrus traveled north, while Cretan pottery sailed east. Gold from Nubia, wine from the Levant, cedar wood from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, all flowed through the ports of the Bronze Age. This was an international economy, the likes of which would not be seen again for centuries. At the heart of it all stood Ugarit, a modest but mighty city-state on the coast of Syria. Ugarit was a place where Egyptian scarabs were found beside Mycenaean swords, where Hittite edicts and Canaanite hymns were written on the same clay tablets. Its harbor, now lost beneath the sea, once bustled with ships that carried not just goods, but newsletters and alliances. Its scribes tracked cargo manifests with astounding precision. 30 jars of oil from Byblos, 200 weight of copper from Alashaya, 4 chariots from the Hittite king. It was a world run by administrators, not conquerors, until the sea turned red. Cracks in the system, but for all its complexity, this world was delicate. The kingdoms of the Bronze Age had built their greatness on interdependence. They were like the towers of a grand temple, tall, impressive, but leaning on each other. Remove one, and the rest would tremble. When trade slowed, cities starved. When tin failed to arrive, weapons dulled. When merchants were attacked, kings demanded explanations. And slowly, the reports began to change. Letters turned anxious. Shipments went missing. There were whispers of trouble in the west, of unrest in the east. Raiders' droughts, failed harvests. The economic machine began to seize. A letter from a merchant in Ugarit reads like a modern shipping panic. There is no tin to be found. The Alashayan ships do not come. We are left with nothing to work with. In a world built on bronze, the absence of tin was an omen. An empire without its metal was an empire with no sword, no plow, and no peace. The cost of distance. Part of the problem was geography. The farther a kingdom was from tin, the more vulnerable it became. Egypt, for all its power, relied heavily on imports. Its wealth came from the Nile, but its weapons came from abroad. The Mycenaeans, despite their warlike image, had to trade across hostile waters to reach the materials of war. The Hittites could mine their own silver and copper, but not tin. When routes from the east were disrupted, whether by climate conflict or collapse, the Western empires were cut off like limbs from a body. The effects were not immediate, but they were unstoppable. The human cost. And what of the people, the farmers who used bronze sickles, the potters who traded with the scribes, the artisans who depended on imports? They had no say in diplomacy or shipping routes, but they bore the brunt of collapse. As prices soared and tools vanished, work slowed. Crops failed. Food became scarce. Panic took root not just in the palaces, but in the fields. In one recovered document from the Hittite archives, a royal scribe notes with quiet dread, "The blacksmiths have no tin. The chariots are not repaired. We prepare for war with bare hands." That war would come, and not just from within. The shadow on the sea. It is here, as trade began to crack and tin began to vanish, that we first hear of them, the sea peoples. They appear in letters and laments. They strike ports and vanish. They do not trade. They burn. In a world built on connection, they were chaos incarnate. But who were they? Pirates, migrants. Mercenaries. A coalition of desperate tribes, or a singular invading force. No one knew then. We still do not know now. But their timing was perfect. Just as the old world was beginning to falter, the sea peoples arrived like a tide of flame. And so the empire of trade. The engine of bronze and peace began to choke. Its sea lanes turned deadly. Its markets turned silent. And its cities, one by one, began to fall. At first they were rumors, just scattered words in wind-battered letters. Kings wrote to each other not of armies, but of shadows. They come from the sea, A Hittite general warned, "They leave no prisoners." Another scribe whispered from Al-Ashia, "They burn the towns before they ask questions." A traitor wrote from Byblos, "They do not speak our tongue." These were not wars as the Bronze Age had known them. These were not the polite campaigns of kings vying for borders. This was something else, something older, more primal. A rising storm with no face and no lega. They were called many names: the Sea Peoples, the Nine Bows, the Northerners, those from the islands. But the name did not matter. What mattered was what they left behind: smoke, silence, and ruin. The first flames, the first confirmed strike, came in the eastern Levant. A cluster of coastal towns, small, prosperous, unfortified, went silent. In Ugarit, scribes documented a pattern of sudden disappearances, merchants who never returned, messages that received no reply. And then came the survivors, burnt, bloodied, terrified, speaking of black ships without emblems, warriors with horned helmets, axes that cleaved stone. In Alashia, ancient Cyprus, once a stable hub of copper trade, reports grew frantic. The coastal towns fell. Their records stopped abruptly. Temples were desecrated, granaries emptied, bronze taken. A clay tablet found buried in the ash of Enkomi reads, "They came in the night. The sea burned. We fled to the hills, but they hunted us." Even now, historians argue who these invaders were. Some say they were displaced peoples from the western Mediterranean, Sardinian Sicilians, or displaced Mycenaeans. Others point to Central Europe, driven south by drought or disaster. There are those who believe they were a coalition born from the collapse. Not the cause of it, a mass migration turned violent. But to the kings of the Bronze Age, speculation was useless. The Sea Peoples were not a mystery. They were death, the end of predictability. For centuries, warfare had been predictable, ritualized almost. The Hittites knew how the Egyptians fought. Mycenaeans understood the tactics of Anatolian hill tribes. There were boundaries even in battle, but the Sea Peoples shattered that. They did not lay siege, they overwhelmed. They did not negotiate, they annihilated. They moved quickly, landing in shallow harbors, swarming like ants, burning stores and temples before vanishing back into the waves. Where others sought land or tribute, they sought total destruction, and they had a strange, terrifying strength. They were not a state. They had no capital, no treaties to sign, no diplomats to bribe, no succession to exploit. They were war distilled, a shifting world. The Sea Peoples didn't just bring chaos, they revealed it. As they struck, they exposed the soft underbelly of the Bronze Age system, its reliance on trade, its rigid bureaucracy, its assumptions of peace. The cities had forgotten how to fight. Fortifications had decayed. Generations had passed in diplomacy, not war. A single letter from a palace scribe in Ugarit captures the horror. "We are a city of scribes and priests. We were not ready. The gods must have abandoned us." In Egypt, Pharaoh Merneptah wrote of Libyans and Sea Peoples marching together bearing strange names: Ekwesh, Shekelesh, Luka, Teresh, Sheridan. It is unclear whether these were ethnic groups, tribal confederations, or simply the broken labels of frightened survivors. But one thing was clear: the storm was spreading. The collapse of confidence. Kings once proud now sent desperate pleas to neighbors and were met with silence. The Mycenaean palaces, once bustling centers of administration and engineering, began to fall one by one. Pylos, Thebes, Mycenae itself, sacked or abandoned. The Hittite Empire facing internal revolt, and external raids disappeared almost entirely. Its capital Hattusa, once among the greatest cities of the known world, was left a ghost. The fire came quickly, and no rebuilding followed. Even mighty Ugarit, a jewel of literacy, diplomacy, and trade, would fall. Its last letters, still unfired in the kiln, remain today as final, breathless cries. One reads, "My lord, the enemy ships are here. My city is lost. My gods are silent." Why the sea peoples came. What drove them: hunger, climate, collapse, vengeance. Some believe their homeland was devastated by drought or volcanic winter. Others say they were mercenaries gone rogue, or victims of collapsing trade themselves, now turned predators. There is no single answer. But perhaps that is the point. The sea peoples were not a cause, but a symptom, the violent consequence of a world stretched too thin, too dependent, too proud. A system designed for balance had become brittle, and the sea people struck like a hammer. The sound of ash. By the end of their campaigns, the sea peoples had changed the map. Not by conquering it, by erasing it. They did not build cities. They did not inscribe their names in stone. They were not remembered in poetry, only in ash. But their legacy was permanent. In their wake, palaces fell. Writing ceased. Networks collapsed. An age ended. What followed was not a new kingdom, but a dark silence. If there was ever a city that symbolized the interconnected brilliance of the late Bronze Age, it was Ugarit. Nestled on the northeastern coast of the Mediterranean, in what is now modern Syria, Ugarit was not the largest city, nor the most powerful, but it was the most connected. Its markets rang with the voices of Egypt, Cyprus, Canaan, and Mycenae. Its scribes wrote in multiple languages. Its people lived in comfort, surrounded by the fruits of far-off lands and the hum of steady trade. Ugarit was a city of letters, and it is through its letters that we now watch it die. A city of clay and diplomacy. The people of Ugarit recorded everything. In clay archives beneath the ruins of its palaces. Archaeologists would later find thousands of tablets, contracts, treaties, epic poems, royal orders, tax records, and merchant logs. Here, writing was not a luxury. It was a tool of life. Scribes wrote in Akkadian for international diplomacy, in Ugaritic for local matters, and even in the newly invented alphabetic script, one of the earliest forms of the alphabet, that would eventually become our own. And then one day, the writing stopped. The final letters into the ruins of Ugarit. Buried beneath the ash of sudden destruction, clay tablets were discovered that had never been baked. Still soft, still waiting to be fired in the kiln. One such tablet was a letter from a merchant to a neighboring ally. The words, hurried and panicked, shake even now. "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came. My city is burned. My goods are taken. I write you not from my home, but from the hills. Help me if the gods still allow." Another address to the king of Elachia, Cyprus, pleads, "The enemy ships are now seen on the horizon. They have done evil things in the land. Do not delay. Send troops. There is no time." But help never came. Or if it did, it was too late. How Ugarit fell. There was no grand siege, no long noble defense. The attackers, likely sea peoples, arrived fast and struck hard. Ugarit's strength was its openness. Its harbor welcomed ships from across the known world. Its walls were modest, for it had known little war. Its people trusted in diplomacy. But these attackers brought no treaty, no warning. They came at night, landing in shallow waters, lighting sails to mask the stars, and descending upon the city like a black tide. They burned first. The outskirts storehouses, merchant villas, shrines. Then they moved inward, targeting the palace, the temples, the archives. Scribes fled with tablets in hand. Priests cried to gods who had long grown silent. The fires spread quickly, not just through buildings, but through memory. Ugarit in a single night was unmade, ashes of civilization. What is most chilling is not just that Ugarit fell, but that it was not rebuilt. Throughout history, cities have burned, empires have crumbled, but they often rise again, reborn from ashes. Ugarit did not. No future king reclaimed it. No children of survivors returned to raise new walls. The city was gone, and so too the delicate world it embodied. Archaeologists who uncovered the site found homes still stocked with pottery, markets still filled with amphorae, a furnace still holding bronze tools in mid-production. Life had not declined. It had been interrupted violently, and finally, it was as if the breath of the city had been caught in mid-inhale and then extinguished. The voices left behind, but Ugarit's people did leave one final mark. Those thousands of clay tablets preserved by the very fire that destroyed the city form one of the richest archives of the Bronze Age. Through them, we see not just trade deals and inventories, but the anxiety of a world unraveling. One letter from a palace scribe, barely legible, reads, "The king prepares the chariots. The gods are displeased. The sea is no longer safe." Another, written by a woman of noble rank, says simply, "My children cry for bread. I have no answer for them. The ships do not return." These are not myths. They are not poetry. They are the voices of real people speaking across time, unsure if they would be heard. And for millennia they weren't, until now. The end of the network with the fall of Ugarit, the Bronze Age world lost more than a city. It lost a node in its great network, a critical link in the chain of trade, diplomacy, and culture that held empires together. Without Ugarit, merchants rerouted. Messages went undelivered. Tin stopped flowing. Confidence cracked. Egyptian scribes noted that grain from Canaan no longer arrived. Hittite ambassadors returned home empty-handed. Mycenaean ships found burned-out harbors where there had once been feasts. The web was unraveling one knot at a time, a glimpse into the abyss. The fall of Ugarit was not the first, and it would not be the last. But it marked a turning point, the moment when the elite realized that what had seemed permanent was in truth terrifyingly fragile. The Sea People's droughts and earthquakes may have been the hammer, but Ugarit revealed the fault lines. In its sudden tragic silence, we hear the prelude to a larger collapse, a Mediterranean world teetering on the edge of an abyss it did not yet understand. And soon that abyss would swallow empires. High in the Anatolian plateau, nestled among the craggy hills of central Turkey, there once stood a city of power, a city of kings and lions of walls carved from basalt and archives written in tongues long dead. Its name was Hattusa, and it was the beating heart of the Hittite Empire. Now it is stone and silence, the Lion Gate Empire. The Hittites had ruled for centuries, a civilization carved from war, law, and diplomacy. At their height, they rivaled Egypt, clashed with Assyria, and corresponded with Mycenaean princes. Their kings bore titles like Great King of the Thousand Gods and Lord of the Four Quarters. Their scribes recorded contracts in cuneiform. Their armies marched in bronze-plated chariots. and their temples smoked with incense for deities that no longer have names. Hattusa was the capital, a marvel of engineering and ambition. Double walls encircled it, massive gates guarded by lion statues. Roads wide enough for 3 chariots led to towering temples, administrative halls, and the Grand Archive, a depository of diplomacy, astronomy, omen logic, and ancient ritual. From here, the Hittites had tamed rebellions in Syria, struck alliances with Egypt, and governed a realm stretching from the Aegean coast to the Euphrates. But in the years before the fall, the storm clouds thickened, whispers in the stone. The archives of Hattusa record a growing anxiety. Messages from border governors turned panicked. Reports of crop failure increased. Earthquakes, strange and frequent, struck sacred hills. Rebellion simmered in the vassal states. Traders reported fewer ships on the horizon. And worst of all, the gods had grown quiet. The Hittites were a deeply religious people. Every action was tied to divine will. Rituals were carried out with precision. Oaths were made in the names of storm gods and sun queens. But now the omens were contradictory. Sacrifices failed. Priests offered blood, but received no visions. Kings consulted oracles, only to receive silence. In one chilling tablet, a royal priest writes, "The stars no longer speak to us. We have followed the rites, but the gods do not answer." The land grows sick. And then came the sea peoples. Assault from without the Hittite Empire was already cracking when the attackers arrived. The western vassals, Arzawa, Luka, and others, had long been restless. Some may have allied with the raiders, others simply collapsed under pressure. The once loyal trade ports now turned into targets. Unlike Ugarit, Hattusa did not fall overnight. The capital stood inland far from the sea. It did not burn from surprise, but from attrition. War came in waves, first along the western coast, then in the mountain passes. Finally, siege reached the heartland. There are no surviving records of the final battle, only what is left in the ground. Burnt layers, toppled stones, scattered arrowheads. It is likely that the empire fractured internally. Loyal governors became warlords. Borderlands declared independence. Troops mutinied. Grain stores ran dry. And the king, we do not know. His name, once shouted in temples and courts, was swallowed by fire. Collapse from within. Even before the swords arrived, the empire was already dying. Like much of the late Bronze Age world, the Hittites were deeply reliant on logistics. Chariots, their pride and power, required trained horses, specialized wheels, and bronze fittings, all imported. Their cities depended on wheat from river valleys, tin from the east, and copper from Cypriot mines. When these stopped flowing, the machine ground to a halt. A recovered tablet from a lower district reads, "There is no bronze. The smiths are idle. The soldiers wait without weapons. The scribes ration wax, and the water shrinks." And then, at some point in the 12th century BCE, the lights in Hattusa went out. The city was burned not by invaders alone, but by desperation. Its temples destroyed, its granaries, emptied, its royal line broken. The last cuneiform tablet was never finished. An empire erased. What is perhaps most chilling is how thoroughly the Hittites vanished. Unlike Egypt or Assyria, they left no heirs. Their language, once taught to scribes across the region, disappeared. Their gods were forgotten. Their roads reclaimed by weeds. Hattusa lay abandoned for over 3,000 years, its name lost even to memory. It was not until the 20th century that archaeologists rediscovered it buried beneath layers of silence. There in the ruins, they found tablets speaking of gods and treaties, weather magic, and boundary stones. A civilization once so mighty, now understood only by fragments. The lesson of Hattusa. The story of Hattusa is not just the tale of a city's fall, it is the story of how a system dies. A system built on long-distance trade, centralized administration, and divine legitimacy. When the trade failed, the food ran out. When the gods were silent, the king lost his mandate. When the king faltered, the empire crumbled. It did not require a single battle to destroy the Hittites. Just disruption, just time. And as Hattusa fell, the rest of the Bronze Age world looked on in fear, or would have, if they weren't already burning too. On a windy rise overlooking the Aegean behind stone walls, carved with ancient pride, the city of Troy once stood. Was it a city of myth? A stage for gods and heroes? Or was it simply another Bronze Age kingdom, caught like so many others in the rising storm? Perhaps it was both. But what is certain is this: Troy burned. And it burned at the edge of a world unraveling. A city between worlds, Troy was more than a legend long before Homer sang its name. Archaeologists have uncovered layers of ruins, stacked atop each other like the pages of a worn book. Not one Troy, but many built, destroyed, and rebuilt over centuries. But around Troy 6 and 7, dated to the 13th, 12th centuries BCE, something changed. This was a city of power. Its walls were imposing, sloped and thick-built to withstand more than time. Its citadel housed nobles, warriors, and scribes. Its lower town stretched to the plains, housing craftsmen, herders, and traders. Troy's location was a blessing, and a curse. It sat at the mouth of the Dardanelles, the choke point between the Aegean and the Black Sea, and where trade flows, so too does tension. The rising heat in the final centuries of the Bronze Age, Troy was entangled in a web of interests. The Mycenaean seafaring kings from the Greek mainland were rising in wealth and ambition. Their palaces at Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns held stockpiles of weapons and tablets detailing military logistics. Their records mention raids across the Aegean tribute from lesser cities, and ships prepared for expeditions. Meanwhile, the Hittites to Troy's east claimed the region as part of their sphere, referring to it as Wilusa. Diplomatic letters speak of disputes over boundaries of rebel vassals and missing envoys. Some even mention a Mycenaean figure named Atarisia, who led a fleet against the region, a name some scholars link to Atreus, father of Agamemnon. Was Troy a neutral trade city caught between giants? Or was it a player manipulating rivals for profit and protection? Whatever the truth, by the late 13th century BCE, its walls faced not just history, but fire. The siege. What exactly happened to Troy in its final days is a question scholars have wrestled with for generations. Was it the Trojan War, as described in the Iliad, a siege lasting 10 years, waged over a stolen queen and the pride of kings? Or was it something darker, less romantic and more desperate? The archaeological layer known as Troy 7 tells a grim story. The city was heavily fortified. Sentries were posted. Storage jars were buried in the ground, evidence of rationing, perhaps siege preparations. Homes were hastily repaired with mud brick. There are signs of fire destruction and bodies found beneath collapsed walls. No golden horse was found, but neither was peace. Mycenae's shadow, It is likely the Mycenaeans played a role in Troy's destruction. Their palaces were militarized. Their tablets speak of weapons, chariots, and fleets. They had the motive. Troy's location threatened their sea routes. They had the capacity their navies could cross the Aegean swiftly. And their myths, they remembered Troy. But if the Mycenaeans did burn the city, it did not save them. Within a generation, they too collapsed. Their palaces fell. Their language vanished. Their scribes were silenced. Perhaps Troy was not the start of their glory, but the beginning of their end. Victory in a burning world is still defeat. The collapse in the legend. Why do we remember Troy when we forget Ugarit Hattusa and Alatia? Because Troy lived on not as a city, but as a story. In the Iliad, the Bronze Age is remembered as a golden time filled with heroes and honor gods and glory. But read more closely, and the story is not about triumph. It is about rage, loss, futility. It ends not in victory, but in mourning. Perhaps Homer knew or sensed that Troy's fall was symbolic of something larger, that behind the clash of spears and shields was a deeper truth, that the world was cracking, and no hero could hold it together. Ashes and aftermath. After its destruction, Troy would rise again, rebuilt in later centuries. But the Troy that fell in the Bronze Age never returned. Its trade was not restored. Its kings disappeared. Its connection to the great networks of the Bronze Age was severed. Its fall is not unique, but it is poetic. A city caught between myth and history, between East and West, between survival and ruin. And so, as dusk fell over the citadel, and the fires of siege painted the sky red, Troy became more than a city. It became a symbol of pride, of fragility, of an age ending. The cities burned, the harbors emptied. The roads that once echoed with the sound of merchants and messengers now crackled under the feet of refugees. As the great kingdoms of the Bronze Age crumbled, a second wave of destruction followed not from conquerors, but from those who had nowhere else to go. This was the exodus, not of one people but of many. Tribes, clans, entire communities torn from their homelands by fire, famine, and fear. They poured into foreign lands not as guests, but as survivors, desperate, hungry, and armed. And with them came collapse. A sea aflame with movement. The Mediterranean, once a highway of trade, became a sea of migration. Displaced by the destruction of cities like Ugarit, Troy, and Encomi, people took to boats large and small, planned or panicked. Some had been merchants or craftsmen. Others were soldiers or farmers. Many were children carried on the backs of their parents. All were now adrift. Some migrated in search of food and shelter. Others moved with fury, seeking revenge for what they had lost. In some cases, the line between refugee and raider, blurred necessity gave rise to violence. Egyptian inscriptions tell of these waves, describing entire confederations of migrants sweeping toward the Nile Delta. Pharaoh Merneptah recorded in stone. The foreign peoples of the sea. Their hearts are fierce, their bodies strong. They come with their families and their weapons. These were not isolated raiding bands. These were entire societies on the move. The land routes break down. It wasn't only the sea that carried migrants, the land did too. Across Anatolia, the burning of Hattusa left a vacuum. Smaller tribes, previously vassals of the Hittites, now marched across the plateau. Some sought to reclaim old lands. Others simply fled. In Canaan, the collapse of Egyptian influence unleashed chaos. Small city-states once protected by imperial treaties were now alone. Many were abandoned. Others fought bitterly to hold on. Raiders from inland hill regions descended on the fertile plains. Settlements were burned and agriculture stalled. Entire landscapes emptied while others swelled with strangers. The resulting mosaic of instability, shifting people's unknown tongues. Unfamiliar gods shattered what remained of the regional order. The Philistines arrive. Among the many peoples on the move were a group the Egyptians called the Peliset, believed by many to be the Philistines. They arrived by sea armed with round shields and feathered helmets. Not merely raiders, they brought women, children, pottery, and livestock. They were a migrating culture. Egypt tried to stop them. In the reign of Ramses III, circa 1175 BCE, Egyptian reliefs depict a massive naval battle off the coast. The sea peoples, including the Peliset, had formed an armada, not just warriors, but whole floating villages. The Egyptians fought them off barely. Ramses claimed victory, and Egypt survived. But even in triumph, he wrote, no land could stand against them. Their hearts were firm, their numbers like the sand. The Peliset were not destroyed. Instead, they settled along the southern coast of Canaan, founding cities like Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Gaza. Here they became the Philistines of later biblical fame. Collapse from contact, these migrations, vast, desperate, and disorganized, had a cascading effect. As one group arrived in a region, they pushed others ahead of them. Communities collided, resources dwindled. Fights broke out over wells, fields, grazing land. Old alliances became meaningless. New tribes rose. Old cities fell. Even where migrants did not bring war, they brought change. Cultures blended. Languages disappeared. Trade systems vanished. The great palace economies of the Bronze Age, built on administrative control and stored surplus, could not adapt. When supply chains broke, the entire system collapsed, not from a single strike, but from thousands of tiny cracks. The stories we inherited. Across the ancient Near East, echoes of this exodus survive, though often warped into legend. The biblical tale of the exodus from Egypt may reflect memories of this time, a people fleeing a collapsing empire, wandering through desert lands, seeking new settlement. The arrival of the Philistines is remembered in the tales of Samson and Goliath, where cultural memory frames them as giants from the sea. Greek legends speak of the return of the Heraclidae, the Dorians sweeping into Greece, displacing Mycenaeans, and ushering in a darker age. Every culture remembers the migrations differently, some as divine punishment, others as epic quests. But beneath the stories, the truth is the same. The world moved, and it would never be the same. A world unbound. By the end of the 12th century BCE, the Bronze Age world had become unrecognizable. The trade networks had collapsed. The great cities were gone. The records had stopped. In their place stood scattered villages, crude homes and oral traditions. Yet in this vacuum, something else began to grow. Cultures, new identities, new beginnings. But first came the silence, the void, the long dark pause after the fall and before the rise, as kingdoms crumbled and cities vanished beneath flame and sand. One power still stood tall, battered but unbowed. Egypt, the land of the Nile, had seen centuries of glory. It had endured droughts, invasions, and dynastic chaos. Its temples stretched like ribs across the desert, and its pharaohs ruled as living gods. But now, in the twilight of the Bronze Age, Egypt was not fighting for conquest or tribute. It was fighting for survival. The storm reaches the Nile. By the early 12th century BCE, the waves of chaos rolling across the Mediterranean reached Egypt's gates. The once strong trade routes from Canaan had collapsed. Cyprus had fallen. Ugarit was ash. The Hittites had vanished. The Mycenaeans were in decline. Egypt alone remained. And then came the warning. They are coming. Not raiders, not a rival kingdom, but a coalition of peoples, entire migrating societies armed and relentless. Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples, a term that would echo across centuries. Among them were groups like the Peleset, Jeker, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshesh. Different origins, one goal land. Pharaoh Ramses III. The last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom took the threat seriously. Unlike other powers who had faltered through arrogance or delay, Ramses prepared. But he knew this battle would not be like the ones before. The invasion begins, the Sea Peoples. First struck by land sweeping down the Levant, displacing city-states and burning ports. They moved like a wave of fire, scattering locals, consuming grain, and toppling walls. Then came the sea assault. Egyptian records, particularly from the Medinet Habu temple, describe what followed in vivid detail. There, Ramses III had scenes carved into stone, not as mere propaganda, but as a warning to the ages. The carvings show warships colliding on the waves, archers lined along Egyptian ships, enemy boats packed with warriors and families, men, women, even oxen, and carts. These were not mere raiders. They were entire peoples in motion, floating on desperation. Ramses knew this, and so he turned the Nile Delta into a trap. The battle in the Delta. As the Sea People's ships approached the Egyptian coast, Ramses lured them into narrow channels where maneuvering was difficult. He had lined the banks with archers, hidden behind reed walls. When the enemy fleet sailed in, Egyptian ships blocked their exit. From both sides, volleys of arrows rained down. In the chaos, some enemy ships capsized. Others caught fire. Warriors tried to swim ashore, only to be cut down by infantry. The carvings show the Nile stained with bodies, tangled oars, and the wreckage of broken ambition. Ramses declared victory. The foreign peoples of the sea were made into heaps, their cities desolated, their bones buried. Egypt had survived. The price of victory, but it was a hollow victory. Yes. Ramses III had repelled the Sea Peoples. Egypt remained standing, temples intact, kingship unbroken. But survival came at a cost. The treasury was strained. The grain stores had been raided. Trade had all but ceased. The vassal states in Canaan were lost, their cities occupied or in ruins. Egypt's influence outside the Nile Valley shrank dramatically. Internally, unrest brewed. Workers at Deir el-Medina, the artisans who built the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, staged the first recorded labor strike in history, citing lack of food and delayed wages. The grand projects of earlier dynasties, the pyramids, the vast temples, gave way to modest constructions and cautious planning. The bureaucracy began to fracture. Tomb robbing increased. Trust in the divine order, the very temple of Egyptian society, began to falter. Ramses III himself would be murdered in a harem conspiracy, not long after his military success. The end of the New Kingdom. Though Egypt had survived the invasions, the New Kingdom, Egypt's last great age, did not last long after. The 20th dynasty slipped into weakness. Central authority waned. Priests of Amun and Thebes gained power, and rival dynasties rose in the delta. Civil wars broke out. Foreign rulers would later seize the throne. Egypt would never again command the Mediterranean, as it once had. The era of Thutmose Akhenaten and Ramses the Great was gone. What remained was memory carved in stone, legacy etched in walls. It is only because of Egypt's survival that we know as much as we do about the Sea Peoples and the collapse. Where other civilizations left ashes, Egypt left records. The reliefs at Medinet Habu, the inscriptions in Karnak, the scrolls buried in tombs. These became the historical backbone of the Bronze Age's final chapter. But even in victory, the tone is not triumph, it is dread. Ramses III's carvings are not glorified spoils, but detailed fears. They speak of enemies without number, of cities that no longer exist, of gods who barely answered. The pharaoh had stood firm, but he knew what had been lost. The last light fades. Egypt was the last great flame of the Bronze Age, flickering in the wind, surrounded by smoke and silence. When it dimmed, the ancient world entered a long twilight. Not total darkness, but a world with fewer kings, smaller cities, and forgotten gods. Yet even in decline, Egypt did what no other did. It remembered. And in that remembering, it ensured that we too would not forget. The sword was not the only destroyer of the Bronze Age. Even as cities burned and invaders landed, a quieter, more insidious killer crept through the land. Drought, famine, and fear. Long before the Sea Peoples reached the shores of Egypt or the walls of Ugarit fell, nature had already begun its siege. The sky withheld its rains. The rivers shrank. The harvests failed. And so in the cradle of civilization, people began to starve. The slow violence of the sky, pollen analysis, sediment cores, and archaeological digs have painted a chilling picture of the years leading into the collapse. Around 1200 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean entered a period of intense climatic instability. Rains failed in Anatolia and the Levant. The Nile's floods became erratic. The once reliable monsoon patterns shifted, and with them, the fates of millions. In a world without industrial reserves, climate was everything. Crops grew only when the seasons obeyed, and when they didn't, people died. Not just from hunger, but from what hunger caused: war, migration, rebellion, and collapse. A letter from a Hittite official to a neighboring king pleads, "My grain has failed. I send word not for diplomacy but for bread. Help us, for the fields are dust." And there was no answer. The grain that fed empires. Bronze Age empires were intricately tied to food logistics. Cities depended not on local farms, but on grain shipments that moved through bureaucratic systems. Egypt had long fed its people and its allies with surplus from the Nile Valley. The Hittites relied on shipments from the lowlands. Ugarit imported grain from inland Syria. Cyprus supplied wine and oil to the coast. The Mycenaeans stockpiled harvests in massive palace granaries. When those harvests failed, the consequences were swift and devastating. Not just famine, but economic collapse. Palaces could no longer pay workers. Scribes could no longer feed their families. Trade dried up not for lack of goods, but for lack of food to exchange. And when the ships no longer came, the riots began. The burning of the poor, In the layers of ash that mark this era, archaeologists find something strange. In many cities, destruction did not come from siege engines or enemy swords, but from within. Fires that began not at the gates, but in the marketplaces, the storehouses, the lower towns. In some places, there are signs of looting and fire, but no battle. It suggests a chilling possibility: internal collapse, rebellions from within, peasants rising against elites, hungry families storming palace granaries, social systems cracking under the pressure of starvation. In Pylos, for example, the palace was hastily fortified shortly before its destruction. Clay tablets document ration distributions and a frantic mobilization of chariots. Then, fire. No evidence of external invasion, but clear signs of panic. Famine, it seems, did what invaders could not. It turned a population against its own rulers. A network unraveled. The Bronze Age was defined by interconnectivity. But that interconnectivity in times of scarcity became a fatal weakness. As each city or region suffered a bad harvest, they turned to others for help, but found only more desperation. The Hittites asked Egypt for grain. Egypt could spare none. Ugarit cried to Cyprus. Cyprus was already falling. Mycenae reached toward Anatolia. Anatolia had nothing left to give. When one strand broke, the web trembled. When all broke together, the web collapsed. Fire as a symptom. Fire spread during this period, not just from battle, but from the drying of forests, the cracking of earth, and the anger of those with nothing left to lose. In some regions, entire agricultural zones were abandoned. In others, cities were stripped of timber and left vulnerable to wildfires. Without workers to maintain irrigation, fields turned to dust. Wells dried. Animals died. In Canaan, towns once protected by Egypt were left to fend for themselves. Local rulers fought over shrinking resources. Villages moved uphill. Trade routes shifted inland. The once flourishing coastal cities were replaced by hilltop fortresses, smaller, more defensible, less reliant on trade. A darker age was beginning, not just militarily, but ecologically. The psychological toll, and what of the people? They lived in fear, not just of foreign warriors, but of the sky itself. When rains failed year after year, it was not just hunger that took hold. It was spiritual collapse. The gods long praised in hymns and fed with offerings grew silent. Temples emptied. Priests were challenged. Kings who claimed divine mandate now stood helpless in front of angry, starving citizens. In a society where divine favor explained everything, famine was not just a crisis. It was a cosmic betrayal. One recovered hymn from Ugarit, possibly written during this time, reads like a lament. O Baal, rider of the clouds, why do you hide your face? The earth cracks. The children weep. Your voice is silence. Collapse from the roots. Civilization is a tree, but no tree grows without water. The Bronze Age collapse was not just a political or military event. It was ecological, economic, and existential. Drought turned hunger into rebellion. Hunger turned trust into fire. Fire turned stone into ash. And ash covered the memory of an age. And even after the swords had been sheathed, and the migrants had settled, and the kings had fallen, the drought remained. For centuries, the Bronze Age world had been a world of words. Stone and clay were filled with the voices of kings and commoners alike. Treaties were carved into tablets. Inventories were inscribed on scrolls. Myths, rituals, prayers all captured in writing preserved for gods and generations. The scribes were not just record keepers. They were the architects of memory. They stitched civilization together with symbols and syllables. They gave voice to empires, and then one by one they fell silent. The death of literacy. The collapse of the late Bronze Age was more than a loss of cities. It was a loss of language. Across the Mediterranean, writing systems that had taken centuries to develop disappeared. They were not transformed. They were erased. The linear B script used in Mycenaean Greece vanished completely. Not a single tablet was written in it after the palaces fell. It would not be deciphered again until 1952 CE. The cuneiform script of the Hittites and Mesopotamians, once used for laws, trade, astronomy, saw a steep decline. In Anatolia, the archives went cold. No more records, no more scribes. Even the alphabetic Ugaritic script, one of the earliest forms of writing with true consonants, vanished with the destruction of Ugarit. Its clay tablets buried under ash were preserved, but the people who wrote them were not. From the Aegean to the Levant, entire literate societies became mute. What was lost, the silence was not abstract. It was painfully real. No more contracts, no more diplomatic letters, no more tax records, ship manifests, grain quotas. No more songs or myths recorded by stylus. The bureaucratic world of the Bronze Age, with its palace economies and detailed planning, relied on writing as a tool of survival. When writing died so did coordination planning, taxation, law enforcement, and long-distance diplomacy. It was as if the very code that kept civilization running had been deleted, and into that void crept uncertainty and forgetting. The disappearance of the scribe class. Scribes had once been elite educated in temple schools, serving kings and priests, trained in multiple scripts. They were the guardians of knowledge. When the palaces burned, they were among the first to flee or perish. Few commoners could read or write. And without the stability of courts or temples, there was no need for writing. In a world where survival depended on soil and steel, the stylus was left behind. No one trained new scribes. The scrolls decayed. The scripts became ciphers marks. No one understood. Within a generation, a written tradition, thousands of years old, had collapsed. In some regions, it would take hundreds of years before writing returned. Echoes from the shadows. There were, however, remnants echoes in the dark. The Egyptians, insulated by the Nile, and with surviving priesthoods, retained their hieroglyphic tradition. But even there, records became thinner, the language more ritualistic, less practical. In the Levant, a few scattered city-states preserved scraps of writing. In Mesopotamia, some scribes continued their work, though far removed from their golden age. But the grand conversation that once spanned the known world from Hattusa to Thebes, from Mycenae to Babylon, had gone quiet. Civilization had once spoken in many voices. Now it whispered, if at all. The role of oral tradition. With the scribes gone, memory had to find another form. Stories were no longer etched in clay, but spoken around fires. Laws were no longer written, but passed from elder to child. Myths, histories, and genealogies survived not through text, but through tongues. This was the beginning of oral tradition, a new way of preserving the past, in a world where writing had failed. But oral memory is fragile. It changes with time. Heroes grow larger. Enemies become monsters. The lines between truth and tale blur. It is likely that many of the legends we know today, the Trojan War, the Exodus, the wanderings of Odysseus, began in this twilight of the scribes, shaped by those who remembered what the pen could no longer record. The psychological silence. The end of writing had another effect, a deeper, more psychological one. Without writing, people stopped imagining the future. Calendars broke down. Long-distance planning collapsed. Knowledge of distant lands vanished. The world shrank to what could be seen, touched, or told. It was not just a loss of memory. It was a loss of horizon. In a society without writing, history ends at the edge of personal memory, and nothing guarantees tomorrow. From silence a seed, yet out of this silence, something new would eventually grow. Centuries later, a new script Phoenician, born on the Levantine coast, would rise from the ruins. It was simpler, easier to learn, less tied to priests and palaces. It would become the ancestor of Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Arabic, and thus the modern world. But for now, that was still far away. For now, the Mediterranean had entered a period of darkness, not total, but deep. Where once the scribes had sung in clay, only echoes remained. Before the collapse, the Bronze Age world sparkled with stone and light. Its cities were marvels, crowned with palaces lined with colonnades, lit by torches guarded by walls, thick enough to swallow an army. Their names once carried the weight of civilization. Knossos, Megiddo, Mycenae, Enkomi, Alalak, Tarsus, and more. Today they lie silent. Their stones cracked, their roads overgrown. Their names, if remembered at all, are whispered in archaeology museums and mythology. In this chapter, we walk among the ruins through cities that were once the anchors of empire, and ask, why did no one come back? Knossos, the forgotten labyrinth. The great city of Knossos on the island of Crete was already ancient by the time Mycenaean Greece was at its peak. Once the jewel of the Minoan civilization, with its legendary labyrinth, vast courtyards, and frescoes of dolphins and dancers, Knossos was a center of culture, innovation, and religion. Though damaged by earlier quakes and invasions, it was rebuilt under Mycenaean rule and remained active into the late Bronze Age. But then silence. There is no single moment of destruction visible in Knossos. Instead, there is a slow fading. The palatial complex, once bustling with religious rites and trade, gradually fell into disuse. Rooms were abandoned. Walls collapsed and were never repaired. No one rebuilt the palace. No new dynasty reclaimed it. Eventually, the people moved away, leaving the frescoes to fade, and the myth of Minos to grow. Megiddo, the city of armies. Megiddo in modern-day Israel stood at the crossroads of war. For centuries, it was a fortified city, commanding a vital pass, the gateway between Egypt and Mesopotamia. It saw pharaohs march through its gates, kings battle in its fields. The very word Armageddon derives from its name, Har Megiddo, the Mount of Megiddo. But during the 12th century BCE, Megiddo was abandoned. Its massive gate complex, carefully designed and maintained over generations, was left to rot. Palaces burned. Temples crumbled. The city, once so strategic, so fiercely fought over, was left empty, a ghost beside the highway of history. Why? Perhaps the trade it had guarded no longer existed. Perhaps the wars it was built to withstand had already come and gone. Whatever the reason, no one came back. Mycenae, the pride of Achaea, perched high on a hill with massive cyclopean walls and the iconic Lion Gate. Mycenae was the heart of Mycenaean civilization. Its kings had ruled over a network of palatial centers, Pylos, Tyrants, Thebes, and beyond. Their scribes wrote in Linear B, Their tombs overflowed with gold. Their ships sailed to Cyprus, Egypt, and Anatolia, but around 1200 to 1180 BCE. The fires came. Archaeological evidence shows a wave of destruction. Pylos was burned. Tyrants fell. The palaces at Mycenae were attacked and abandoned. The great storehouses were looted. The administrative centers, once the nerve centers of a continent-spanning network, were turned to charcoal. The linear B tablets end. And afterward, Mycenae was never rebuilt as a center of power. Instead, its name became legend, a word carried not by stone, but by Homer's breath. Enkomi and Alalak, trading hubs no more. Enkomi and Cyprus had once been a vital node in the copper trade, the very lifeblood of bronze production. Surrounded by workshops and filled with foreign goods, it was cosmopolitan, wealthy, and industrious. But it was sacked, its buildings burned, its storage jars shattered. Some inhabitants tried to rebuild, shifting slightly to a new settlement. But the scale and richness of Enkomi never returned. Similarly, Alalak in northern Syria had once been a palace center, connected to both the Hittite Empire and Mesopotamia. Its archives recorded diplomacy, land ownership, royal marriages. Then it too went dark, another city swallowed in the wave. The pattern of abandonment. This is what defines the Bronze Age collapse more than fire or blood. Not what was destroyed, but what was not rebuilt. Throughout history, cities have risen and fallen, but often they rise again. Babylon was sacked and revived. Rome burned and was rebuilt. Jerusalem was destroyed and returned. But not Knossos, not Mycenae, not Megiddo, not Ugarit, not Enkomi, not Hattusa. These cities died and stayed dead. This suggests something more than conquest, something deeper. A complete unraveling of the social, economic, and political systems needed to support urban life. Without trade administration, surplus food, and political stability, cities could not function. They were no longer assets. They were burdens. People scattered to smaller villages, fortified hilltops, or self-sustaining rural communities. In many places, we find signs of people near the ruins, but never returning to them. The Bronze Age city as a concept had failed. Ruins that speak. And so the cities were left to crumble. The wind blew through collapsed doorways. Dust settled in banquet halls. Mice made homes in palace corridors. Frescoes flaked into nothing. Statues fell and were buried. And for a long time, no one knew their names. It would take millennia for archaeologists to rediscover them, and even longer to understand what they meant. But even now, standing in the ruins, there is a sense of awe and of mourning, because these were not just cities. They were ideas, and the ideas had died. As the old world burned, a new metal cooled in the ashes. It was not as beautiful as bronze. It did not shine like gold. It was harder to work and more difficult to smelt. But it was everywhere in the hills, in the soil, beneath the feet of peasants and kings alike. Iron, it had long been known. Traces of it had been used by blacksmiths in Anatolia and Mesopotamia for centuries. But in the Bronze Age, it remained a curiosity, expensive, inefficient, symbolic. That would change, because when the old trade collapsed, when tin vanished, copper grew scarce, and the scribes stopped writing. The people turned to what they could reach, not what they once imported, and that was iron. The death of tin. To understand the rise of iron, we must first understand the fall of bronze. Bronze had been the lifeblood of empires, but it required copper and tin two metals rarely found together. Copper came mostly from Cyprus, tin from distant lands, Afghanistan, Iran, perhaps even Britain. The trade networks that brought them together were vast and fragile. When those networks collapsed in the 12th century BCE, tin effectively disappeared. Without tin, bronze could not be made. The swords dulled, the axes cracked, the plows failed. The very tools of civilization rusted into silence. So the survivors scattered across hills and valleys, looked for alternatives. And there beneath their feet lay iron ore. From ornament to arsenal, at first iron was difficult to use. It required much higher temperatures to smelt than copper. It needed new furnaces, new tools, new techniques. Early iron was often impure, brittle, inconsistent. But it had one advantage: abundance. Unlike tin, iron was everywhere in Anatolia, the Levant, Greece, Italy. It needed no ships, no foreign kings, no treaties. It only needed labor, patience, and fire. So blacksmiths began to experiment. The earliest iron tools were crude for farming, digging, cutting. Then came weapons heavier, rougher, less ornate than bronze, but stronger, more durable. Eventually, a breakthrough came: carbonization. The process of folding small amounts of carbon into the iron, creating steel. It was accidental at first, but it changed the world. The Iron Age dawns by 1000 BCE. Iron had replaced bronze across much of the eastern Mediterranean. Not in cities, those were gone, but in villages, tribes, forts, and fields. The Iron Age did not begin in palaces, but in forges built with calloused hands far from the ruins of old kingdoms. It was a revolution from the bottom up. Iron plows cut deeper into neglected soils. Iron weapons armed common men. Iron nails rebuilt homes, wagons, and shrines. And with this new material came a new kind of society, one that did not need distant trade, one that did not worship palace scribes, one that did not remember the gods of bronze. The democratization of violence. Bronze was elite. Its creation required trade control oversight. Its weapons were wielded by charioteers, aristocrats, professional soldiers. Its cost ensured that war remained in the hands of kings. Iron changed that. Suddenly, any village blacksmith could arm a warrior. Tribes once subjugated by palace armies could now fight back. Raiders grew bolder. Kingdoms decentralized. Local warlords and clan chiefs took power. Iron spread violence, but also freedom of a brutal sort. With it, old hierarchies were smashed. The Bronze Age elite, who had ruled with golden scepters and bronze axes, were buried, sometimes literally, by men with simpler tools and stronger blades. Cultural rebirth in fire. The shift to iron did not just change weapons and tools, it reshaped culture. Mythologies evolved. New gods of war and forge emerged. Oral traditions forged in the silence of the scribes celebrated not noble kings but wandering heroes, jubilant self-emit. The Homeric epics, likely formed during the early Iron Age, speak not of organized empires, but of personal honor, long sieges and the chaos of fate. They remember the Bronze Age, but only through a smoky lens. Temples changed, burials changed. Art changed. The soft curves of Minoan frescoes gave way to hard geometric lines. Pottery became simpler, but bolder. Stories grew darker, more personal, more mortal. The Iron Age brought no utopia, but it brought a new voice. The old world is not revived. This is perhaps the most important lesson. The Bronze Age did not come back. The cities were not rebuilt. The treaties were not re-signed. The scribes did not return. The palaces remained ruins. The gods fell silent. Instead, humanity moved on. The Iron Age was not a continuation, but a reinvention. It was born from collapse, but it was not a restoration. It was new, raw, unrefined, but it worked. And from it, centuries later would rise the seeds of classical Greece, imperial Assyria, biblical Israel, and archaic Rome. But that was still far ahead. Now there were just ashes and iron. The world that rose from the ashes of the Bronze Age collapse was no longer a world of kings and palaces, but one of tribes, villages, and memory. The great empires had fallen. Their roads were overgrown, their gods forgotten or renamed. But in the void they left behind, new people stirred groups. Once marginalized, scattered, or silent, they were not rebuilding the past. They were building something new. The Greek Dark Age begins in Greece. The fall of the Mycenaean palaces was total. Linear B. Script vanished. Trade collapsed. The cities were abandoned. Population declined dramatically. For over 300 years, roughly from 1100 to odd BCE, Greece entered what historians call the Dark Age. But even in darkness, life endured. Smaller communities emerged in the hills and valleys. Local chiefs ruled modest households, not grand courts. People lived in stone huts, herded animals, and worshipped old gods with new names. It was during this time that the oral tradition blossomed epic songs about a world now gone, tales of Achilles, Odysseus, Agamemnon, and Troy. By the time the Greeks began writing again with a new alphabet derived from the Phoenicians, they had reinvented themselves. The city-states of Athens, Sparta, and Corinth would not rise from palatial ruins, but from tribal memory and village resilience. The Philistines of Canaan, along the southern coast of Canaan, a new people appeared, the Philistines. Egyptian records call them the Peliset, one of the invading groups in the Sea Peoples Confederation. Unlike other raiders, they settled. They built fortified cities, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gaza, and Gath, the so-called Pentapolis. Their culture was distinct. Their pottery, known as Philistine bichrome ware, showed Aegean-influenced curved shapes, painted patterns, animal motifs. Their diet included pork, unlike the local Canaanites. They brought new architectural styles, weapons, and social customs. In time, they clashed with the emerging Israelites, becoming remembered in biblical texts as powerful enemies. Giants, armored warriors, idol worshippers, figures like Goliath, the champion of Gath, symbolized this cultural conflict. But archaeology reveals more than conflict. It shows blending intermarriage, shared markets, and cross-cultural exchange. The Philistines were not destroyers. They were settlers of a new era. The early Israelites. In the highlands of Canaan, another group began to rise, one whose story would shape the world for millennia. These were the early Israelites. They did not descend from a palace culture. They left no royal archives or temple walls. Their homes were modest, built on terraced hills. They practiced agriculture and herding. They avoided pork. Their pottery was simple, but their identity was strong and unique. They seem to have emerged gradually from Canaanite populations, possibly influenced by migrations, climate pressures, and local discontent. Over time, they developed new religious practices centered around a single invisible God, Yahweh. Unlike the gods of Egypt and Mesopotamia, Yahweh had no statue, no temple at first. He moved with the people. He spoke through prophets, not priests. The earliest Israelite settlements show no signs of hierarchy or central authority, just communal structures and fortified granaries. It was a new kind of society, one born not in wealth, but in survival. The Phoenicians take to the sea, while others turned inward. The Phoenicians' descendants of the coastal Canaanites looked to the sea. Their cities Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, and later Carthage, were never true empires, but they became masters of trade, rebuilding what others had lost. The Phoenicians developed a simplified writing system, an alphabet based on Ugaritic and earlier Canaanite scripts. Unlike cuneiform or hieroglyphs, it used only 22 letters. It could be learned quickly, even by merchants and sailors. This innovation would change history. Their alphabet spread across the Mediterranean, adopted by the Greeks and then the Romans. It became the ancestor of most modern alphabets in use today. The Phoenicians traded not just goods, glass, purple dye, timber, but ideas. They reconnected the Mediterranean at a grassroots level from port to port, not palace to palace. Other rising tribes and peoples. Across the former Bronze Age world, other groups rose. In Anatolia, the remnants of the Hittites formed Neo-Hittite city-states, smaller, localized, but still vibrant, clinging to fragments of the old culture. In Mesopotamia, the Assyrians would begin to rise again, eventually building one of the most ruthless empires of the Iron Age. In Italy, small Italic tribes laid the cultural groundwork for what would one day become Rome. In the Zagros Mountains, new Iranian tribes emerged like the Medes and Persians, destined to reshape Asia. Even in Egypt, though, weakened local rulers and Libyan tribes would form dynasties that extended influence deep into Africa and the Levant. These new peoples did not rebuild the Bronze Age. They replaced it, a different kind of power. Where the old world had palaces, the new world had forts. Where the old world had treaties, the new world had oral oaths. Where the old world had scribes, the new world had storytellers. It was a world of tribal identity, regional resilience, and practical innovation. And in many ways, it was more sustainable. Without reliance on global trade or centralized bureaucracy, these new societies were harder to topple. Their power came not from spectacle, but from adaptation. The map redrawn. By the end of the 10th century BCE, the Bronze Age map had been completely redrawn. The great empires of the 13th century were gone. In their place stood a patchwork of tribal kingdoms, fortified towns, and fledgling cultures, many of which would go on to shape the Iron Age world. The future now belonged to those who had survived. The scribes were gone. The cities lay in ruin. But the stories survived. Though the Bronze Age had ended in silence centuries later, voices began to rise again, this time around fires and poems and on the lips of wandering bards. They spoke not in clay tablets or palace inscriptions, but in myth. And within those myths, layered in metaphor bent by memory, were fragments of a real apocalypse. The Iliad, a war that was and wasn't long after the fall of Troy, Greek bards began to tell of a great war between East and West. The Iliad, attributed to Homer, recounts the wrath of Achilles, the burning of Troy, and the sorrow of heroes doomed by fate. It is poetry, not history. The gods interfere. The warriors are larger than life. Yet archaeology shows that a city was there, that it burned, that Mycenaean Greeks once sailed across the sea to fight, that the war may not have been about a woman, but about trade control and survival. In the story of Troy, we hear the echo of the Bronze Age collapse. A proud city falls. Alliances fracture. Heroes fight not for glory, but in desperation. The Greeks generations after the collapse remembered not the bureaucracy, not the grain shipments, not the treaties, but the fire, the loss, the rage. And they turned it into epic. The Exodus, a flight from ruin. In the Hebrew Bible, the book of Exodus tells of a people enslaved in Egypt who flee into the wilderness guided by divine fire and pillar of smoke. They wander for 40 years searching for a land of promise. The story is religious symbolic foundational, but scholars have long debated whether it preserves a memory of real migration, perhaps linked to the chaos of the collapse. Could the Israelites have been part of the refugees displaced by the Sea People's movements? Or native Canaanites fleeing collapsing city-states? Was Egypt truly the oppressor, or simply the last surviving empire in a dying world? Regardless, the shape of the story fits: a society unmoored, a journey through desolation, the struggle to form a new identity after empire. Exodus may not be a historical record, but it is a survivor's tale. Atlantis, the memory of a lost world. Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, spoke of Atlantis, a glorious civilization that fell in a single night of fire and flood. He placed it far beyond the Pillars of Hercules. He called it hubristic, divine, and doomed. Historians have debated for centuries whether Plato invented Atlantis entirely or based it on older stories. Some point to Thera Santorini and the volcanic eruption that devastated the Minoan world. Others suggest echoes of the Bronze Age collapse, writ large plague war earthquakes, and the sea-swallowing cities. What matters is not whether Atlantis was real. What matters is that the ancients remembered losing a golden age. They remembered a time of connection, prosperity, and wonder, followed by sudden total ruin, and they passed that memory on. Floods, giants, and golden ages across the ancient world, myths of collapse abound. Mesopotamia gave us the Epic of Gilgamesh with its flood that wipes clean the world. The Hebrew Bible tells of Noah, another righteous man surviving catastrophe. The Greeks spoke of 5 ages of man, each more degenerate than the last. The Bronze Age ending in war and death. In Hindu tradition, the Kali Yuga marks an age of darkness preceded by great destruction. Even among the Norse, there is Ragnarok, the end of gods, and fire-consuming worlds. These stories are not coincidence. They are cultural scars, mythic ways to cope with historical trauma. They encode memory in metaphor, fear, in fable, truth, in tale. The purpose of mythic memory, why remember in myth? Because myths comfort. They give meaning to chaos. They turn collapse into catharsis. The Bronze Age did not leave behind historians. It left behind survivors. And those survivors lacking scripts, scribes, or safe cities kept the past alive in the only way they could, by turning it into story. Over time, those stories changed. Heroes grew stronger, villains more wicked. The causes faded, the emotions deepened. But in the heart of every myth is a truth, that a great world once was, that it fell, that we are its children. A mirror for the present, these ancient myths are not just remnants. They are warnings. They remind us that civilizations are fragile, that wealth and connection cannot prevent catastrophe, that climate migration, inequality, and war can break even the strongest systems. But they also remind us that human memory is resilient, that even in silence, the past finds a way to speak. You do not need to believe in Troy's gods, or Atlantis's machines, or Noah's Ark to hear what the stories are telling us. Something great was lost, and someone lived to remember. The palaces were gone, the tablets no longer written, the temples abandoned, the gods silent, and in time, the people, those who survived, those who endured, forgot, not in the way one forgets a dream upon waking, but slowly, like a shoreline, swallowed by the tide. The details faded, the names were lost, and the great world of the Bronze Age slipped beneath the surface of human memory. A new world began, but the old one, magnificent, complex, interwoven, was left behind, buried in silence and dust. The fade into obscurity. By the 10th century BCE, the vast, sophisticated systems of the Bronze Age had vanished without replacement. No kings of Ugarit sat on thrones of cedar. No scribes in Hattusa recorded the cycles of the heavens. No merchants sailed with ingots from Cyprus to Crete. No emissaries wrote letters signed to my brother, the great king of Egypt. The generation born after the collapse knew only the fragmented present. They grew up in villages, spoke dialects their ancestors would not recognize, prayed to gods that had no temples. They may have walked among the ruins, the collapsed columns, the scorched walls, the shards of painted pottery, but they did not know who had built them. To them, it was not history, it was myth. The end of globalization. For a time, the late Bronze Age had been the world's first-rate experiment in globalization, a web of trade, diplomacy, cultural exchange, and mutual reliance, stretching from Greece to Babylon. It failed, and in its wake came a period of localization. Small kingdoms, independent tribes, isolated economies, oral traditions, modest ambitions. It was not the end of civilization, but it was the end of civilization as it had been imagined. A world where great powers coordinated, negotiated, and collaborated across continents. That vision would not return for centuries. What was lost? The material losses were immense. The alphabet of Ugarit wiped away before it could spread. Thousands of written texts and entire languages gone without descendants. Architectural knowledge of palace construction, fortification, and city planning. Artistic styles, metallurgy, seafaring traditions, mathematical insights, all disrupted or erased. But the deeper loss was one of continuity, where history had once been carefully recorded and handed down. It now broke apart. Generations no longer knew the stories of their forebears. Lineages fractured, nations vanished. The grand conversations of civilizations fell silent. The Bronze Age world had dreamed of eternity. Instead, it became ephemeral, the seeds of a new order. And yet, not all was gone. In the Levant, the Phoenicians rekindled trade. In Greece, the oral epics of Homer began to circulate. In Canaan, the Israelites formed a distinct cultural identity. In Mesopotamia, the Assyrians rebuilt their empire with iron and fire. The Iron Age would not imitate the Bronze Age, it would surpass it. From its crucible of collapse, new political forms emerged. Kingdoms based on law, not lineage. Communities built on shared belief, not palace command. Writing systems designed for access, not exclusivity. The modern world in many ways is the child of the recovery, not the collapse. But that recovery took time, generations, centuries, and much was lost forever. A warning across time. The story of the Bronze Age collapse is not just ancient history. It is a mirror. It shows how complex systems, even those built by centuries of prosperity and wisdom, can fail when too fragile, too centralized, too interdependent, and too confident. It shows how climate migration, inequality, and violence can collide to unmake worlds. It shows how the elite, insulated by bureaucracy and belief, may not see the collapse until it's at their gates or already inside. And it shows how memory fades unless we fight to preserve it. The echoes remain today. You can walk among the ruins. In Mycenae, the Lion Gate still stands silent and watching. In Ugarit, the buried archives still whisper their final words. In Hattusa, broken stones mark where kings once ruled. In Knossos, faded frescoes still flicker with sea-blue dreams. And if you listen not with your ears, but with your imagination, you can hear them. The last scribe still writing as the sky darkens. The blacksmiths forging rough iron in place of shining bronze. The mothers fleeing burning cities with children clutched to their chests. The kings staring into the distance waiting for ships that would never come. When the world forgot, and then remembered, eventually the world remembered. Not all at once and not clearly, but with time, the ruins became questions. The shards became puzzles. The myths became maps. And today we can reconstruct what was lost not perfectly, but meaningfully. We now know that civilizations are not eternal. But neither is forgetting. The story of the Bronze Age collapse is not one of hopelessness. It is a story of transformation. It is the story of how a world died, and how slowly, painfully, beautifully, another world began.